So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this month's Discover Tennessee History webinar. We're really excited to have you join us today for what is almost the end of this year's series. We have this month and next month for this series as we wrap up for the school year. So a couple of quick things as we get started. If you are new to joining us live, please be sure to keep your mics muted. We are recording this for inclusion on a YouTube channel later on for other folks to view at their leisure. If you are joining us live, be sure that you rename yourself so we see your first and last name. And one of the real perks to being able to join live, of course, is to interact with us and your colleagues here. So feel free to open that chat box, introduce yourself, ask questions. We will be monitoring that throughout this session. And so that's a good way to, again, kind of keep the conversation going and be able to interact with us throughout. There will also probably be a few chances for you guys to respond to some questions and stuff throughout the presentation. So if we get to one of those points, feel free to unmute yourself and to respond to presenter questions as we go forward. We do have a Padlet where you'll be able to find resources for this session as well as for past in this series. And so here is the link for that. We will also, of course, you can access it through the QR code. We will be adding things from today's session there in the coming days. So know that anything that you see today, you will be able to access it there. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Stacy Graham, who is going to kick us off talking about place-based learning and Sanborn maps.
All right, thanks, Kira. Yes, I am going to show you the Library of Congress's Sanborn map collection. And so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can I share my screen? Okay, hang on a second. Okay, so you can all see the Library of Congress's Sanborn Maps collection page, right? Okay, excellent. Thank you. Now, this is one of the many maps collections that's at the Library of Congress and that they digitized. And this is a fantastic collection if you're not already familiar with it for using in your classrooms, because there's so many things to use that bring in local history and kind of the growth of towns across just about every state in the United States, including Tennessee. There is a lot of the history of the Sanborn maps that you can read if you're interested by going to this Articles and Essays tab and looking at the introduction to the collection, which is a very long essay by one of the librarians of Congress that works there about the history of this. So I'm just going to summarize that and to just, for those of you who aren't already familiar with what a Sanborn map is. And basically, Sanborn maps exist to assist fire insurance companies in ascertaining what buildings in any given town or city are at risk for fire damage, so they can assess what kind of insurance to, charge or claim. So the development of these kinds of maps goes hand in hand with the development of fire insurance companies in the United States. Now, the very first maps like this were actually created in London, England, in the late 18th century. And there was somebody who did maps of Charleston, South Carolina in 1780 for a London-based insurance company. And so that's that's a lot earlier than what I thought the history of these maps were. Now, those aren't Sanborn maps yet, but it does show you that there are a lot of people, a different group, like creating these maps before they're officially, the Sanborn map collection. The earliest that were created in the United States were around the 1850. And this was for the city of New York. And so there were some companies that were starting to make these maps right before the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, this really picked up, and there were a lot of companies creating maps. And part of the reason for that is because the process of making maps, there's a technological process called lithography. And some of you may be familiar with lithography from prints and other things that you've seen on the Library of Congress website and other places. Very, very common form of printing images in the late 19th century. And that creates a boom in terms of the types of things that you can publish, and makes maps much, much easier to produce because you don't have to engrave them individually. And so there's tons of maps being created right after the Civil War. And of course, there are lots of insurance companies also being created because we have this kind of the second industrial revolution picking up in the United States at that time, and the growth of towns and urban areas, which really kicks off in the second half of the 20th century. And so Sanborn was a man from Massachusetts, and he was actually hired by an insurance company to make maps beginning in 1866. And some of the first maps he created were actually for Tennessee cities, which I didn't know until I read this article. And unfortunately, those don't exist, or at least they don't exist on the Library of Congress's website. His original maps of certain Tennessee cities in 1866. But shortly after that, he went into business for himself, and he created this company right after the Civil War, which was basically a map making company that worked with fire insurance companies so that they could supply them with these maps, because insurance companies, they didn't want to have to go out to every city and personally inspect every single building in order to determine what kind of fire hazard it might or might not be. So these maps helped them make decisions on how to insure buildings that they don't have to see with their own eyes. But beyond the purposes of fire insurance, they're really interesting to us for lots of reasons, which Kira and I are going to discuss in a little bit greater detail in a bit. But let's take a look at some examples. Oh, and by the way, the Sanborn Map Company is still around today. I'm going to show you. I just Googled it. Apparently, they do a bunch of like GIS and geospatial things now, and like LiDAR and other kinds of things, with lots of kind of those very technical kind of ways of making maps and aerial surveys and stuff like that now. So they're still around. They're just not making these city fire insurance maps anymore because that business has moved on to a different model. Now, the key to understanding a Sanborn map is the key. So I am going to click on this. Hopefully you can see it a little bit closer. We're just going to look at this key right up here. So these maps are color coded. And the colors are very, very significant because it tells you what kind of materials each building is made out of. And why would that be important to fire insurance companies? Because they want to know which ones are made of wood, which ones are made of brick, which ones are made of concrete, which ones are made out of stone or adobe or other kinds of materials, because that determines whether or not it's a fire hazard. And so they have all these different kinds of abbreviated ways of conveying this information. And so the key on the map, as your students ought to know, is what they need to be focusing on first. That'll help them understand what it is that they're looking at on the rest of the map. Now, you can also get a little bit into the weeds by looking at what these other kinds of little dash lines or symbols mean, but that just depends on how in detail you want to go. But I did think it was kind of neat, this little special hazards section over here that tells you that the buildings that are shaded in green are singled out as being especially bad for, being prone to catching on fire. And so I think it's neat because they actually list the types of industries that they consider to be high risk. And so this is kind of a snapshot of the types of industries that would be found in these types of cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which is the heyday of these types of maps. So, bakeries, a place with an oven would be a good fire hazard, I would say, especially with a lot of flammable things in it. Um, but then there are things like cooperages and fur dressers that may not be as familiar to our urban landscape today. Tanneries and tin shops and wheelwrights and molasses houses. Um, and these are just the ones that are one little dot or one little X of being extra fire hazardish. And so the further you get down this list, the more dangerous and fire prone these businesses are. So I love this bleaching works and bookbinderies. Now, of course, a lot of these industries operate in completely different ways with different materials today. So it doesn't mean that a bookbindery today is as fire prone as a bookbindery 100 years ago. But still, reading the types of businesses that they would have, I think, helps your students understand the types of jobs people had and the types of industries and trade and kind of like what made cities kind of what formed the basis of their economies and, how did people get their goods? Nowadays, we probably import most of the stuff from another country. But what does the city look like when it's producing a lot of these manufactured goods on its own, or at least, getting them from big hubs in the United States? So I love it because so down at the very bottom are the most fire prone things. So chemical laboratories. Yeah, I would say that's still the case today. Coffee and spice mills, drug mills, fireworks on sale, match factories, oil boiling houses. It's kind of reminds me of an episode of The Simpsons. Like they're making fun of it. Like you would be driving down a street and you'd see signs for, varnish making and turpentine distilleries and tar boiling houses because it's just kind of ridiculous how flammable that sounds, even if you don't know what it is. But those are the types of things that you need in order to make consumer goods at this point in time. So that's just a look at the key and an introduction. And it shows you just the level of detail. So let's look at some detail. Okay. I am going to save that one for later. And I am going to go. Can I show them the Memphis example, Kira, or were you going to do that? Okay. I am going to show them a Memphis example. Now, you can search for Tennessee in the results. So within this collection, you can search, a certain Tennessee city. You can look at Tennessee and you can see there's 34 different hits there. And that's just for the Memphis search. And so you can narrow it down by date range. You can see that there were some of these that were being produced up until the 1950s. And that's about the end of when Sanborn maps kind of were, in use. They really petered out after the Second World War. And they moved to a different business model. And of course, the insurance companies moved to a different business model where they didn't need these maps anymore. But some of these that are dated from the 50s are revisions of earlier maps. So the date that you want to look at is actually like 1907 and not 1951. Now, each of these is not just a single page. So you can see, 117 sheets, and a key. So they're a little bit hard to go through each and every one of these things. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a walkthrough. Hold on a second. All right. So let's say we click on one, and I have the one from 1888 as an example. Now, this one says view 67 images in sequence. So if we click on this, you're going to see a bunch of pages and you're going to be like, okay, where do I go? The first page or two are going to be um, another type of key to help you narrow down which part of the city you want to look at. And so if we zoom in, we're going to look along the riverside here. And so looking at this area here on the river and where, you know, there's a bunch of railroads coming through, we see this yellow block right here, and it says the number 3. So we're going to want to look for the pages that say 3. And so how will we do that? Well, I'm going to go back to where it shows you all of the pages together. And the numbers are usually up in the top corner. So this page and actually the page right before it are going to be the layout that we're wanting to look at. So if you look closely at this, you can see that it's a book. These have already been bound together in a book, even though they would have been separate pages when they were produced. These were bound together in a book. You can see the fold of the book right there. So it's like if the book were open, you'd have these 2 pages right next to each other. And so you can see the river. Here's Wolf River coming in off of the Mississippi. And you can see all the railroad tracks. And so what kinds of buildings would be located near rivers and railroad tracks? And right away, you see a sawmill. And you'd be like, well, why would you have a sawmill next to a river and railroad tracks? Because that's how you transport the lumber to other places. You either put them on the boats that would be in the barges at the docks, or you would put them on rail cars. Another building would be the cotton press and storage. Now, of course, Memphis was a huge cotton hub in the late 19th century. And so they had this huge cotton storage building, again, right next to the main arteries of transportation, your railroad and your river, because that's how they transported these things to other parts of the country. Now, one of the cool things about using these maps is because you can cross-reference them with other types of sources. And I'm going to get to that in a second, but I do want to show you just another example of, this one has a few more buildings, so you can kind of get an idea. Now you see a lot of yellow. Does anyone remember what the yellow means? Let's see. It's a frame building. Yellow is a frame building, and a frame building means it's made of wood, a wood frame building, wood sides. So that's a fire hazard, of course. A lot of frame buildings, they would have been quick and cheap to build. And so here you see a lot of lumber warehouses. The D stands for dwelling. This would have been a boarding house right here on the corner. So maybe a lot of workers, like dock workers or cotton workers, would board there. Again, more dwellings here. So a kerosene and lubricating oil warehouse with gasoline. So I would say that would be a fire hazard that an insurance company would want to know about. Here we have a lime warehouse. And so it's like, what kinds of industry would be located in this part of the country? And I mean, of the city. And here we have a beer brewing house, where there's a freezing room and a beer cellar. There's a condenser. So they even go inside the buildings and tell you some of the equipment that's in the buildings, because that is still important to know. What are the interior walls made of? And, you know, what are the dimensions of these buildings? And so there's so much data in here that ends up telling us just kind of like what these cities looked like and what these buildings looked like and what kinds of things went into these industries. So there's no watchman Two men sleep in the building. The lights are electric. There's also gas and candles, water from an artesian well. Why would they need to know the water source? Just in case there's a fire, right? But that's interesting information. Who would be sleeping in this building? Like, who is this here? And what would they do? How would they move around it? Etc. And so, here's a fertilizer shop. We're going to get more to this later. But one thing to note is that this is during the Jim Crow period of segregation in US history. And maps used the word colored as a neutral word. Yes, it was neutral sounding back then to white people, at least, to designate the parts of town that were, African-American buildings. And so this colored church would have been an African-American church. And so why would there be an African-American church in the middle of this industrial sector, And so that's an interesting question that we're going to get more to when we look at what Kira has to say. But so I just want to talk a little bit more about how you can cross-reference these with other kinds of primary sources. So one thing I'm going to do, which I didn't think to have ready for you beforehand, I'm going to go to photos, prints, and drawings, and then I'm going to write Memphis cotton, because I know that there are a lot of photos of these cotton sheds from the early 20th century that were taken and put, and a lot of these are of like the cotton parade. So that's why you see a bunch of people. But then you also see pictures like this of the barges that would have had the cotton loaded onto them. And you see all these workers down on the riverside, and you see the bales of cotton. They would have come out of these, storehouses where they were probably brought by rail and then put on these barges. So this gives a different dimension to what was happening in that map, what the map was depicting. Excuse me for a second. Excuse me. But there's another type of source that I wanted to show you that you could cross-reference with this, and that is a different kind of map called a bird's eye view or perspective map. And the collection name at the Library of Congress is Panoramic Maps. So if you go there, you can find many from Tennessee cities. And here's one from Memphis, just a year before that Sanborn map. So if we zoom in on this little part where the Wolf River separates from the Mississippi, we can see what these buildings look like. So again, going back to what they look like in the map, a sawmill and this cotton storage warehouse, here they are as depicted on the panoramic map. Here's a sawmill. You can see all the lumber laying out in the lumber yard. Here's this ginormous cotton storage building. And then these have the names of the streets on them so that you can cross-reference to where you are at if you're the kind of person who likes to follow along on a map, that is. So for example, if we want to find this brewing company and see what it looked like, we would locate it down here on Main Street. There it is. And this has the number 15 on it. So if we want to find out what it should be a brewery, right? There it is. The Schlitz Brewing Company, Milwaukee. And there it is. So it's two different ways of looking at the same building in space, as well as industry in a town's economy. And so I'm a map person. I just get really excited when I see things like that. And it might help your students kind of think about cities from all sorts of different points of view. So the next time they're going through town, they might wonder, what's that building made of? What is it next to? And I can show you tons of examples, but first I'm going to turn it back over to Kira to show you a really cool one that some of our teachers came up with.
Thanks, Stacy. See, I have got a couple of different examples I want to show you guys of ways that you could possibly construct some activities around using Sanborn maps in the classroom. And I'm actually going to show you guys the one that the teachers created for us in the lesson, but I'm going to show you that last. I wanted to start with showing you kind of another example along the lines of what Stacy was showing you. But instead of thinking about, again, one of our larger cities in the state, I want to think about how we could use that with some of our smaller towns. And so, this is where it's really cool what you can do with Sanborn maps, is thinking about, how towns and cities grew, but, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and thinking about, again, change over time, how people are interacting with the environment around them. And so, using some compare and contrast with these maps are a great way to do that. So I looked up my, the county seat of where I live. And so Carthage is the county seat here in my area. And so I wanted to see what they had for this, for Carthage here in the Sanborn map collections. So you'll see that there are actually few. We have one from 1894, that's the earliest, a 1903, a 1908, and a 1913. If you're looking for your town or city and you run across one of these are ones that have not been digitized yet. And so you can't actually access anything. So if you see this right here, just scroll on past those because you can't actually view those digitally. So again, that was kind of what our choice is. And so I want to do a little bit of a comparison looking at this 1894 map and then looking at the 1913. So again, thinking about how this small town here in Middle Tennessee kind of changed and evolved over that 20-year cycle there. So what is interesting, of course, the first one we're going to look at here, this is the 1894. It is just one sheet. So everything that they marked is just here on this one sheet. And it really is pretty much just focused. Oh, wait. Get things where it will center. There we go. All right. So it's really kind of just focused on kind of the Main Street area, kind of about a 2-3 block area just north. You can see here's the Cumberland River here. You'll note that there is a sawmill that's referenced over here kind of in the corner by itself, which I thought was kind of interesting. But we're really going to pay attention to kind of the courthouse area and the main 2 blocks of the Main Street area here. One of the things that makes Carthage a little unique is that it is one of only about 4 or 5 towns in the state of Tennessee that has an antebellum courthouse. There aren't many of them that remain. There is the one in Carthage is still there. And so again, first thing you might want to have students identify is what is the major landmark? The courthouse. So we see it here in this 1894 map. Also on that same block, we've got a barber shop. And we have a well that's noted here, which I thought was interesting. You'll see that there's not a whole lot here across. There's just a couple buildings on the street across from it. We have a grocery and a Masonic hall on the 2nd floor, which is still there. And see a grocery and an ice house. And we've got a bank on the corner there. Another bank, a drugstore, office, printing, grocery, and a hotel. We've got a dwelling here, but again, not as many buildings as you might expect to see or students today might expect to see here along this area. And there is one church that's noted up here, but a lot of kind of empty space here right along in the Main Street area. So, you might ask students ask questions like, okay, well, what are some of the key businesses? How did people, get from place to place? Were there cars? Were they riding horses? Well, we know at this time, again, they were riding horses. So, we might ask again, why was it important beyond just, fire purposes to know this well, but, how might this well have been used? You would have drawn water, of course, to be able to water your horses. So all right. So the next one we're going to kind of compare that to is then the one from almost 20 years later, and this one is 1913. So right off, the map is expanding. We're now 3 pages. So we'll start again, like Stacy mentioned here, we want to look at that first one to kind of get a sense of how they have mapped the city or town. So again, we see there's an area over here that's on this side of the river, kind of in the far corner. A couple of probably more kind of industrial areas. But what we really want to note here, kind of the Main Street Court, this is the same area we were looking at before. So we want to look for the second one. So again, gonna make sure again there is our 2 here so we can see again we are looking at kind of the same area. So again, let's look for that, what is that core piece that we want to see if it's still there. And again, that courthouse is the main thing that we are looking at. Here is our major landmark. It's also interesting this time we see the courthouse has got a lot more detail about kind of the interior portions of it, which I think is interesting. Stove heat. We can see across the street, there are a few more buildings now, right? This is way more than we saw on the other one. We do still have the grocery store with the Masonic Hall, but we now have a hardware store. We've got a billiards and a telephone exchange here on the corner. So again, we can think about advent of technology. Telephone is now a thing. And so what would a telephone exchange been used for? Noting it's on the 2nd floor there. So general stores here. We've got some new buildings here. We've got multiple banks, office buildings. Our hotel is still here, although we note that the name has changed. So the name has changed. It's expanded with a dining hall and a kitchen. We have, Sissy, you know what this is? Where it says ventilator?
A restaurant?
Ah, yeah, that's what that is. Maybe ventilator means like whatever kind of
Yeah,
yeah,
to I'm
smells
guessing,
smoke and
funnel the fumes out
yeah.
of the kitchen.
Maybe that's what this right here is. That
Yes, those little hatch marks would be windows because it'd be important to know where the windows are in buildings in case there's a fire.
so sewing machines, offices. Let's see if our church is still here. But again, we see that there are a lot more buildings along Main Street. So, you might ask your students, what has happened in the 20 years between the first map that we looked at and the second map that, might have caused this area to grow. The other thing that's changed, where's our well at? Our well's not here anymore. Why is that not noted? So, that might be something in conversation to have with students. And this is where again, using these maps is a great way to again really kind of dig into local history, especially if you can find one for your local area. And even if you wanted to, like, if you could take students out and do a little bit of a walking tour, give them a 1-2 block area with the copies of these maps, and they go through and like which of these buildings is still here. Here in Carthage, several of these buildings that are referenced are still here in some form or fashion. At least the bones of those buildings are. So that is definitely something to think about. Let's see. Close that one. And then, of course, what you can do is compare this, of course, to if you can't physically go and look at the area, you can do, just Google Maps or Google Earth if you wanted to do that. And you could do some comparison. And so, again, here is our historic courthouse. We can see, much of this block has not really changed a lot. The courthouse has remained, there. These 2 buildings were added along the way, but, no other buildings were added along here. We see
stage of what seemed like
yeah, we see several different business here. The Masonic Hall that was referenced in both of the previous ones is still there. The hotel is still there. So again, things that you could pull out and again using Google Maps, or again, if you can, be able to actually get to where students can go and see this, the buildings and actually, physically be able to do some of the comparisons. Is a great way to explore that. One of the other things that we wanted to note to you guys is we had some teachers a couple years ago now who did this wonderful lesson on the Bass Street community in Nashville. And if you're not familiar with this community, it was over close to where Fort Negley is. And so this lesson plan is really about, how do we map and, explore the history of communities that are no longer there? How do we begin to document their histories? And so this lesson plan presents a couple of really cool ways to think about how you can use Sanborn maps. So I'm gonna show you guys, this is a really involved lesson plan, but what I want to show you is the portion that is, let's see here. So one of the things in this lesson plan is this PowerPoint here. And so students go through and they look at a couple of different communities as kind of comparison. So what do we do when we want to look at community history for communities that aren't well documented? And so the students go through and do stations. So in station 2, they're exploring the Bass Street community. And, it starts out with, what are some images that we have of Fort Negley, which is the major landmark that would have been there. So you have these images that you could kind of pull in. There is a little bit of kind of written history that's been done from some folks who've been doing some archaeology work and some stuff around Fort Negley to document it. So kind of give students a little bit of an overview. And again, what I thought was really cool was how they used the Sanborn maps. And again, so we can see right here would be where that area is. And then comparing that, of course, to what happened to that community. And so a modern map showing that area, which of course is where Interstate 65 is. And so what happened to this community? It was displaced because of urban renewal and interstate construction. And so you can actually, click on this and it kind of gets into, what happened, and you can, be able to click on these maps and kind of really get into the history of what happened to this community. But again, this is where, again, kind of doing that compare and contrast. Using the Sanborn maps can be particularly, I think, interesting for students. But the other thing that I really like about this and why I wanted to, highlight this one is, like Stacy mentioned, these maps in themselves are pretty cool, but they're even better when you can start to layer in other types of primary sources with them. Because when we start to layer different types of primary sources, students can really get a sense of what life was like in these communities. And, sometimes that's where students struggle, right? Because, this stuff seems like it happened, a million years ago. And how are they supposed to connect when the world that they're studying is so different than the world they live in now? And this is where, again, sometimes between using the maps and thinking about what businesses were there and what were the, where did people live? Where did they go to church? Where did they go buy their groceries? All of those kind of things. But then you can also layer in newspapers. And this is where, the Library of Congress, and here's some other maps that's included in this. You can census records are another great resource that you can begin to layer into these. With these, they went through. We can talk about who were the people who lived here, what were their jobs, how old were they, again, that kind of information. They did some archaeology work here. And so again. Oh, wait. Sorry, guys. Sorry. All right. This is what I was wanting to show you guys. So they went through, these teachers did, and they found a series of newspaper articles about community events that were taking place in Bass Street. So whether it was announcement about parties that were being had or receptions or obituaries. Like all of these different types of letters give us a glimpse into the everyday lives of the people who lived in this community. And again, this is where, like, seeing the buildings and seeing, like, again, what businesses were there, like that's all, really cool. But like when we can start to layer in kind of that personal element, all of a sudden, these community histories can become much richer. And students can then start to identify with, the areas that you're studying. And so when we think about maybe some of the bigger events that are taking place, in the country or in the state, you can then come back to, okay, well, how did this impact the people who lived in this community that we've been looking at? And again, it helps students to kind of really start to personalize and connect to the history that you're talking about on a different level. The Library of Congress, again, has wonderful resources for newspapers with the Chronicle of America collection. They're currently in the midst of doing some major updating to the interface for that collection, going to make it even easier to use than it is currently. And there are a lot of Tennessee papers from the same time period that you'll find Sanborn maps, again, late 19th, early 20th century. So again, that you could really start to do this same type of layering with your own communities. So that is, again, just a few ideas of how you could approach, using Sanborn maps in the classroom, how you can start to piece some things together to really do some kind of rich local history piece with your students.
So can I show them another example now?
Sure.
All right, I will. And I am going to go back to my screen. Hang on. Okay. So, back at my screen. Hold on. I gotta move my bar. There we go. So under the articles and essays, they have these 3 different essays. One is that introduction to the collection that has that big, long history that's really more about the company, the Sanborn Maps company, than it is about the maps themselves. But then they do have these other 2 pieces that talk more about the maps using examples. And so one of them kind of does what Kira just did with Carthage, looking at, Coney Island, New York, through 3 different maps from 3 different time periods, and looking also at Santa Fe. So that gives you some more ideas about how to look at these maps over time. But then there's also the Sanborn Samplers tab that just gives you kind of different ideas for how to approach different topics that might connect with your curricular area, like looking at railroads and how they can anchor towns, and how they, what kinds of buildings do you need when you have a big railroad hub in your city? What kind of industries are going to be close to that and needed, and what, for instance, these little round buildings, what is that? And so it's a place where they repair the passenger and their freight cars, kind of like Thomas the Tank Engine. They have that kind of little circular thing. Talking about the steel industry, what kinds of buildings are associated with that? How does that look on the landscape? How much land do you have to devote in your city to develop an industry of this scope? So again, we're thinking about the expansion of cities with the expansion of these industries. The stockyards, see the mining districts, John Deere and the development of mechanized agriculture, Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, the Ford Motor Company. And then they have this little thing. Okay, they also have Tuskegee and Waikiki, but then they have this little blurb about the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville. And since that's kind of closer to many of us than these other places, I thought we'd take a look at that. So they are looking at the 1914 map depicting the Ryman, which was actually built in 1892. But when we're talking about the Ryman, of course, it's gone through many different uses as a building. So if you were to write a biography of the building. It would, be okay. It started life as a tabernacle. And then I love how it says needing additional income. The man who funded the construction tried to get other monies in by promoting it as a venue for theatrical performances and musical performances. And so it actually becomes the Ryman as we know it today as kind of a side venture of its original purpose of being a church. But you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, that's church. So this is looking at the Ryman in a different way. So I went, for one thing, if you click on this from the article, just a little bit of a warning, and you might find this in some of the older pieces on the Library of Congress's website. It takes you to this page, which is a bibliographical page, but it's a very, very old one. This is a fossil left over from a part of the library's website that does not exist anymore. In the URL, you can see the word memory. So this is from an American memory collection. And those of you who may have been with us for a long time, that may jog something in your memory. You can look at it in here, but this is very clunky. So I just looked for it in the Sanborn Maps collection. And that's what we're going to look at now. So here it is. And, but to show you how I got to this page, again, like, okay, Nashville's a big town. It's not like Carthage. It has more than 3 pages to this map. And the number of the page does not correspond to the number of the image. So when it says like image 3, image 4, image 5, that doesn't mean Sanborn map number 3, Sanborn map number 4, and Sanborn map number 5. You just have to, don't even look at the image number for now. But we're going to go to that very first page and be like, okay, we know that the Ryman is located between Broadway and Commerce and between 4th and 5th. So that means it's in the 3 block across the street from the number 2 block within this larger shaded pink area that has this number 1 over it. So that means volume 1, page 3. So that is what we're going to look for. Now, I have to admit, it's a little bit hard to find when you're looking at all of these in sequence. So all of these are volume 1, by the way. So where's page 3? This is where you just kind of have to, squint and see, well, there's 2, there's 3. So that's how you find page 3. And you're looking for this black number up in the corner, not image 7 of 116. And if we're looking, it should be very obvious which building the Ryman Auditorium is. Thank goodness it hasn't changed names since 1914. And then it talks about, okay, 50 feet to eaves, seating capacity 5,000 to 6,000. And if that sounds wrong to you, you are correct. Because this notes that it's an overstatement by about 15 to 2,500. So they must have just been guessing and not there for an actual event. Or they probably didn't ask anybody, right? They just did some sort of like formulaic guess. But you can see the balcony, and the balcony is an iconic part of the interior of the Ryman. So it was interesting for me to read how, let's see, the balcony was not part of the original plan, but was added to make the building more attractive to renters. So I was like, oh, well, that was a really great idea, whoever thought of that later on. But you have the dimensions and you have the windows. Of course, these are those iconic kind of Gothic arch windows that are different colors today, that are just so very photogenic when you go visit. But you can see the shape of the roof here. It's got kind of this hip side, and this is the top part. And then this kind of round area. So the stage would be here. Wait, no, the balcony. This is the balcony. So the stage is here, and then you've got your 2 floors, and then the heat is a steam. The lights are electric. There are 12-inch pilasters spaced 8 inches apart. A pilaster is a column that's pressed against a wall. So I guess that's part of their information. But then it's interesting to look and see what is around it. And so if we kind of go next door, there's a synagogue right next door, which is interesting when you think about the different kind of religious communities that would have put themselves in the same area, because I guess once you build one, then it kind of gives an idea of that block being a church area. Look over here, there's a Pentecostal tabernacle just behind it. And that's part of the Trevecca College, which is now located on Murfreesboro Road. And so what did Trevecca College have? It had a kitchen, dining room, a gymnasium, classrooms, living rooms above. And then there, it had this big Pentecostal tabernacle next to it. Repairing player pianos, I get that must be a separate thing. But then you can see that there's some quote unquote Negro tenements. And, so where's the African American community living in these Jim Crow towns? Because, of course, this was a Southern town, so there would have been segregation in terms of where people were allowed to live and work. But then what kinds of things were around it? So we have garage repair, boarding house, lodging house. I'm not entirely sure the difference between all those things. I'm guessing boarding is somewhere where you live for longer periods of time, and lodging might be like more like a hotel. That's my guess, but
that would be my guess too. Yeah.
Okay. But that would be a good question that your students will no doubt ask you. And of course, the D means dwelling. And does anybody remember what the pink color stands for?
Wasn't pink bricks?
Yeah. So if you go back to our key, the pink is a brick building. So and if there's a pink outline, it means there's just brick around the edges to give it a facade, to make it look like it's an entirely brick building when really it's a wooden building with bricks on the. They do that a lot today still. So a lot of these buildings were brick. And then so you see mostly a brick and then some wooden additions, some frame additions onto the back. Now here we have Broadway. It probably was loud back then too, frankly, with all of the horse traffic. And I wonder what kind of buskers they would have had outside of these establishments on Broadway then. So, admittance refused. Oh, they weren't allowed back there, I guess. I don't know what that's about. All these little boxes that you see are interior like chimneys. And the numbers in front of them were the addresses. So this is 402 Broadway. But it also tells you, information about the streets. There's a pipe here. I know that in the Carthage one, it said macadamized. That would have been the surface of the road. And so, oh, look, a summer theater not used. And here we have printing and newspaper office. This is where the historic Printer's Alley was located, that I remember was still kind of operating when I was younger, and now it's just about gone. But you can see why it was called that, because they had all these different types of printing businesses in this part of Nashville, mostly book printing, newspaper printing, other kinds of printing. Like, why would they have printing there? Well, we're very close to, the seat of government for the state. So it'd be important for reporters to have, access to newspaper buildings. So, you have the National Guard here as well. Oh, and we found a fireproof construction building, and it's a bank. So you would want to ask students, why would a bank take special pains to be fireproof? And I think that they would probably have some very, very good guesses. But it's just kind of interesting to see what are the types of shops that would have been, in the capital of our state at this time. Tailor's shop, sign painting, pianos, billiards, pool and billiards. Why so many billiards places? They might think that's kind of weird because billiards places are associated with, bars and stuff today, and they're a bit rare. We could talk about, well, how people gathered and kind of interacted with each other on a community basis, like the separation of men's spaces from women's spaces, the separation of white spaces from black spaces. And here we have the First Presbyterian Church. I believe this is this the Egyptian Revival one? The famous one that was built by the same guy who did our Capitol, Strickland? Possibly. More printing, livery. Of course, livery. I would reckon your students would not know what a livery is unless they're from more rural parts of the state. But that's where you take your horses. That's where you park your horses when you come to town. Nowadays, you look at a Google map view of Nashville, you see parking lots. This would be the parking lot in 1914, which is the year my grandmother was born. Bicycles, you could talk about the bicycle craze. There's a whole chapter in Chronicling America where they use newspaper articles to talk about the bicycle fad of the early 20th century. So that would be a really cool thing to cross-reference. Etc. I could go on and on because this is just so cool to just kind of walk down these streets through these maps and to see all the levels of detail. But lest it overwhelm your students, they could at least look and be like, okay, pink is brick, yellow is wood. I can see what's a church. I can see what's a grocery store. I can see how these towns looked before a lot of the urbanization projects that came through in the mid to late 20th century. So I am going to turn it back over to Kira.
All right. So again, we will be posting links to many of the things that we showed you guys today. That will go up on the Discover Tennessee History Padlet page. So give us a day or so to get all of those posted for you. But no, again, we'll share links to all of the maps that we showed you today. We will be back next month. The final in the Discover Tennessee History webinar series for this year is going to be presented by the East Tennessee Historical Society, and we're going to be helping with that as well. And it's going to be focused on a local look at the founding of the nation and how you can use local and state history to really kind of hopefully help students to connect to that 8th grade unit that looks at kind of again the founding of the nation, the writing of the Constitution, all of that. So we'll have some really cool stuff to share with you for that one next month. And again, that is on the 2nd Tuesday in March. We, of course, invite your feedback. And if you're interested in getting a PD certificate, it is required for you to complete this link, the survey at this link. So we'll also drop that into the chat box. If you are viewing this later on, you can also use this QR code.
Can you go back?
Yeah, sorry.
I'm trying to copy it so I can put it in the. I can't quite type that fast, but I'm typing this up to drop in the. Hopefully, I haven't just made a mistake there.
Yeah, so we check these about once. We check these once a week. So again, go ahead and complete that. And then we will be sending your certificate out to you within a week of you completing it. And again, you can access it using this QR code as well. Again, thank you guys so much for joining us today. If you have any questions, Stacy and I will be sticking around for a few minutes after we conclude this recording. Again, have a great day, and we hope to see you next month.